From the television studios of the Jack J. Valenti School of Communication at the University of Houston, my name is John David Powell, and this is the Discovery section of Graffiti, the electronic newsletter of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. Afghanistan is the topic of this month's discussion with our guest, Frank Holt, professor of history and the author of Into the Land of Bones, Alexander the Great in Afghanistan. Professor Holt is one of the world's leading authorities on Alexander. The History Channel has featured his research, and he is frequently cited by National Geographic, Smithsonian, and BBC Current Affairs. In his book, Into the Land of Bones, Professor Holt explains how three modern superpowers, Great Britain in the 19th century, the Soviet Union in the 20th century, and the United States today, continue the struggle began by Alexander more than 2,300 years ago, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
My pleasure, thank you.
I'm rereading Churchill's Memoirs of the Second World War, the abridged version, not the 6 volumes that you have. And I was struck the other night on his recollection, or when he was explaining that they were ready to fight the First World War, using the same tactics, the same mentality, the same troop movements. So they were just totally unprepared for what Germany was going to throw at them, because their mindset was 1917, 1918. So now here we are. We find ourselves back in Afghanistan. We've been there before. Yet we're fighting this 20th century war against these people that are really living centuries ago in what they do. Are we having a problem? Is this what we should be doing based upon your research?
My research suggests that the nature of the warfare in Central Asia hasn't changed much in 2,300 years. The causes of war might change, the slogans that we use to justify war might change, but the actual combat that takes place in places like Afghanistan really doesn't pay heed to the same time frames that we do. And that's why when we first sent troops into Afghanistan in November 2001, the first major engagement near Mazar-e Sharif featured a number of Special Forces U.S. troops riding into combat on horseback. Mm-hmm. And Donald Rumsfeld very famously remarked that he was proud that the first attack of the 21st century had brought back the horse cavalry. So in some ways, the nature of fighting in places like Afghanistan cannot really be changed. We find ourselves fighting the same kinds of resistance that Alexander did in the 4th century BC.
And tell me about that.
Well, it's the same kind of situation in the sense that Alexander invaded in 330 BC. He had a sophisticated army, the best of his time. It was, in a sense, as we would say, asymmetrical warfare, the warfare of a superpower against a group of tribal nomadic peoples. Alexander's overwhelming force, however, could not be brought to bear as he would have liked it to. In the first years of his campaigns, he had won a series of major battles every year, and just like dominoes, he had toppled over the Persian Empire. He had conquered everything from modern-day Albania to Afghanistan. It took him longer to conquer the single area that we now call Afghanistan than it took him to conquer the entire rest of his empire. It took far greater casualties. It took a far greater toll on him personally. He suffered more personal injuries there. His troops suffered more. The nature of the resistance intensified. There were more civilian casualties in that combat. So that Alexander's invasion turned into a long quagmire. The worst period of his storied life were the years that he spent fighting in what was then called Bactria, what is now Afghanistan.
Well, why is it that they were just fierce? Not because they were fierce fighters, but I would assume it had to be with the society, with the terrain.
Part of it is logistics. Part of it is the fact that you have a sophisticated army that expects to fight pitched battles, large-scale battles against organized enemies. You win the battle, you win the day, you win the war. Mm-hmm. In a place like Afghanistan, you fight essentially an insurgency. Like us, Alexander, when he first invaded Afghanistan with overwhelming force, was deceptively successful. I mean, the opposition toppled almost immediately in the same way that we swept the Taliban from the north down into Pakistan in just a matter of months. Then the insurgency erupted for Alexander. And by the second year of the war, by 329, 328 BC, Alexander was trying something that we would call, I suppose, a surge. He invaded with 37,000 troops. In the second year, he brought a second army of 22,000 more troops to help shore up his campaigns there. Because you're fighting a resistance movement that's very mobile, that melts back into the population when the opportunity arises. You're fighting in an area which has no fixed borders, no obvious frontiers. And so Alexander, of course, had to do what we can't. He had to do cross-border fighting. Alexander did not hesitate to invade places that we are reluctant to move troops into, like Pakistan, so that Alexander could stamp out the resistance. But that resistance was strong because, again, it tended to be tribal. There was a religious dimension to it then, as there is now. The religions have changed. It was Greek paganism versus Persian Zoroastrianism. But and that's why the title Into the Land of Bones, because, for example, in Afghanistan, the local peoples left bodies out to be eaten by devourer dogs. And it was called the Land of Bones. Bodies were left in a way that the Greeks considered a desecration of the body. If you read your Homer, the worst thing you can do is to leave a body abandoned and to have wild animals eat at it. And so you have these two very different cultures coming to bear against each other in a place like Afghanistan. And the result of that is spiraling casualties, interminable warfare, logistical nightmares that Alexander had never faced before. Alexander lost more men, again, fighting in that region than anywhere else in the course of his campaigns. And when Alexander finally left the region in 327 BC, it was by declaring victory and leaving behind 30,000 Greeks to occupy the territory. And even then, the first area to revolt when Alexander died in 323 BC was Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan. It was the least stable part of his empire then, in the same way that it's one of the least stable parts of the world today.
All right, if historians were running the world and running the military, and you were the king of historians, what would you do in Afghanistan today, based upon your research and everything?
Well, the historian is at a disadvantage here because, first of all, you put me on a war that I didn't choose. Had the historians been running the world, I think that we would have to define our aims more clearly. If our original aims in invading Afghanistan in 2001 were to eliminate bin Laden, to eliminate the Taliban, and thirdly, perhaps to end the opium trade, we have struck out 3 times. We have to understand the limitations of modern warfare, and that some of those limitations are the same as in ancient warfare. The terrain favors the local population. If we cannot freely cross borders, if you cannot hunt down every insurgent, as Alexander did, he hunted down every insurgent relentlessly. And even then, he wasn't entirely successful. We don't have those options. The best our soldiers can do is to pursue to a certain point and then turn it over to Predator drone, missile-firing aircraft and things of that type. So that we are limited in ways that even Alexander wasn't. We have the better technology, but we have political constraints that Alexander didn't have to face. So as king of the historians, as ruler of the world, I would have to suggest that we reconsider what it means to win in Afghanistan, that we tailor our expectations to a place that has hosted unwinnable wars for millennia. And we have to learn the lessons that the Soviets learned, that the British learned twice in the 19th century, that Alexander learned in the 4th century BC. And that is, when you move into an area militarily, you need to know what the end game might happen to be. And I think a phased withdrawal is probably the best that we can do. We're not going to transform the area. We can momentarily stabilize it, and that may be all that we can hope for.
I think Ahmed Karzai said this week or a couple of weeks ago that it's a generational thing. Even if it does transform, it's going to be generations.
It's a multi-generational thing.
Frank Holt, professor of history at the University of Houston and author of Into the Land of Bones. Fascinating read. I haven't read it yet, but I was reading the back and parts of it, and I think people maybe should take a look at that.
I appreciate it.
A little current history, and thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next month.